The sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the small town of Cedar Grove. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets were hard to keep, and where the slightest change in routine could set tongues wagging. But lately, something, or rather, someone, had been quietly stirring curiosity among the locals. Every night, as darkness fell and the town settled into its quiet rhythm, an elderly woman could be seen sitting on the same weathered green bench at the park. She was always there, wrapped in her old beige coat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her posture was dignified, almost regal, and her eyes held a faraway look, as if she were lost in thoughts too heavy to share. At first, no one paid her much attention. After all, plenty of people enjoyed the cool evening breeze at the park. But as the nights turned into weeks and then months, her routine became impossible to ignore. Rain or shine, she was always there, sitting alone under the street lamp that flickered just enough to make the shadows dance. She never seemed to speak to anyone, nor did she carry anything with her. No book, no phone, no bag. Just her and that quiet, mysterious presence. People began to whisper, who was she? Why did she come to the park every night? And why that specific bench? It was situated under a massive oak tree, its gnarled branches stretching out like protective arms. The bench itself had seen better days. Its paint was chipped, and its surface worn smooth by years of use. But to her, it seemed to be more than just a place to sit. Among those who noticed her nightly ritual was Sheriff Mark Henson. Cedar Grove's sheriff was a man of few words, respected for his fairness and keen sense of observation. Mark had grown up in the town and knew its rhythms better than most. He prided himself on keeping the peace and looking out for the community. So when the calls started coming in, first from concerned citizens, then from those who were simply curious, he knew he had to check it out. It's probably nothing, he told himself one evening as he grabbed his hat and keys. But deep down, he felt a nagging sense of unease. Something about her persistence, her silence, and the way she sat there night after night tugged at his instincts. He decided to pay her a visit, not to interrogate her, but to offer her a kind word and maybe figure out if she needed help. That evening, as he pulled his patrol car into the parking lot, the sun had long since set. The park was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustle of leaves and the faint hum of cicadas. He spotted her immediately. She was in her usual spot, sitting perfectly still, her figure illuminated by the faint glow of the flickering street lamp. Mark took a deep breath and approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Evening, ma'am," he said gently as he stopped a few feet away. The woman didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned her head ever so slightly and looked up at him. Her eyes, though tired, were sharp and piercing, as if they could see straight through him. For a moment, Mark felt an odd chill, though he couldn't quite explain why. "Evening, Sheriff," she finally replied, her voice soft but steady. She didn't seem surprised to see him, as though she'd been expecting this visit all along. Mark tipped his hat and gestured to the bench. "Mind if I join you?" She nodded, and he sat down beside her, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a while, they sat in silence, the night wrapping around them like a thick blanket. Mark waited, giving her space to speak first, but she remained quiet, her gaze fixed on something far off in the distance. Finally, he broke the silence. "I've noticed you've been coming here a lot," he said carefully. "The folks around town are starting to wonder if you're all right." Her lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile, but it was tinged with sadness. "People always wonder about what they don't understand," she said. Mark nodded, unsure how to respond. He could feel the weight of her words, though he didn't yet understand them. "Is there something I can help you with?" he asked after a pause. She shook her head. "No, Sheriff, but I appreciate the offer." He studied her for a moment, noting the deep lines etched into her face and the way her hands trembled ever so slightly. She looked fragile, but there was a strength in her demeanor that made him hesitate to press further. Still, his curiosity got the better of him. If you don't mind me asking, why his bench? Why every night? Her expression softened, and for the first time, she turned to look at him fully. This bench, she said slowly, holds memories that I can't let go of. And as for why I come every night, she trailed off, her gaze drifting back to the darkness. Let's just say I made a promise. One I intend to keep. Mark frowned, his mind racing with questions. What kind of promise would drive someone to sit here every night, no matter the weather? And what memories could be so powerful but they tethered her to this spot like an anchor? Before he could ask anything more, she stood up, her movements deliberate but slow. It's getting late, she said, pulling her coat tightly around her. Thank you for keeping me company, Sheriff. Mark rose to his feet as well, unsure of how to respond. Will you be all right getting home? He asked. She nodded, offering him a small but genuine smile. I'll be fine. Don't worry about me. With that, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. Mark stood there for a long moment, his mind buzzing with unanswered questions. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, that left him unsettled. As he made his way back to his car, he glanced over his shoulder at the empty bench. It looked so ordinary now, just a piece of wood and metal sitting under an old oak tree. But Mark knew there was more to it, more to her, than met the eye. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The truth behind her nightly visits was far more profound and far more haunting than he could have ever imagined. And as the days turned into weeks, Mark found himself drawn deeper into the mystery, unable to let it go. Little did he know, uncovering the truth would change everything he thought he knew about his town, his job, and even himself. The next day, Sheriff Mark Henson couldn't shake the encounter from his mind. There was something about the woman, something intangible but deeply unsettling, that stayed with him. It wasn't fear, exactly, but an inexplicable need to understand what had tethered her to that bench night after night. He told himself it was just his duty to look after the people in his town, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. At the station, he casually brought up the topic to his deputy, Charlie. Charlie was younger, eager, but still learning the ropes, and had a tendency to gossip. You ever notice that old lady at the park? Mark asked as they sipped their morning coffee. You mean the one on the bench under the big oak? Yeah, I've seen her, Charlie replied, leaning back in his chair. Kind of hard to miss when she's there every single night. Some folks think she's a little, you know. He tapped his temple, grinning, but Mark didn't smile. She's not crazy, Mark said firmly. There's something else going on. Charlie raised an eyebrow. You talked to her? Briefly. Didn't get much out of her, though. She said she made a promise, and that the bench holds memories. Mark rubbed his chin, thinking, I just can't figure out what would drive someone to do that. Maybe she lost someone, Charlie suggested, his tone more serious now. People grieve in all kinds of ways. My grandma used to leave flowers at my grandpa's favorite fishing spot every week for years after he passed. Could be something like that. Mark considered this. It was a reasonable explanation, but it didn't feel quite right. There was something in the woman's demeanor, something in the way she spoke, that hinted at a deeper story. Later that afternoon, Mark decided to dig a little deeper. He started by asking around town. Cedar Grove wasn't big, just a few thousand people, and if anyone knew anything about the woman, word would get around quickly. At the diner, he spoke with Martha, who'd been serving coffee and pie to the locals for decades. Oh, you mean Miss Leela, she said when Mark described the woman. She's been here as long as I can remember. Used to be a teacher, back in the day. Real sharp mind, but quiet. Always kept to herself. What about family? Anyone close to her? Mark asked. Martha shook her head. Not that I know of. She had a husband once, but he passed years ago. No kids as far as I can tell. Just her now. The pieces of Leela's life were starting to come together, but they still didn't explain her nightly visits to the park. Mark thanked Martha and moved on, stopping by the library where Mrs. Crandall, the town's unofficial historian, worked. Mrs. Crandall's eyes lit up when Mark mentioned Lila. "Ah, Leela Thumpson," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. She was one of the best teachers this town ever had. Taught English at the high school for nearly 30 years. A lot of the kids she taught went on to do great things. She had a way of inspiring people, you know. Mark nodded. "Did you know her personally?" "Not well, no," Mrs. Crandall admitted. She was always polite, but private. Kept her personal life separate from her work. I do remember hearing about her husband, though. A tragic story. What happened? Mrs. Crandall hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. His name was Arthur. He was a kind man, from what I recall. Worked at the lumber mill. One day, there was an accident. He didn't make it. Leila was devastated. She disappeared for a while after that, but when she came back, she was different. Quieter, more reserved. Mark felt a pang of sympathy for Leila. Losing a loved one like that could leave scars that never fully healed, but he still didn't understand the connection to the bench. "Do you know if there's any significance to that spot in the park?" he asked. Mrs. Crandall shook her head. "Not that I know of, but if I were you, I'd check the town records. You never know what you might find." That evening, Mark found himself poring over old files at the station. Most of the documents were mundane: property deeds, park maintenance records, and the like. But then he came across a faded black and white photo tucked into one of the files. It was of the park, taken decades ago. In the foreground stood the bench, freshly painted and surrounded by flowers. Sitting on it were a young couple, smiling at the camera. Mark's breath caught. The woman in the photo was unmistakably Leila, though much younger. Her hair was dark and her eyes bright with happiness. Beside her was a man who must have been Arthur. They looked so full of life, so full of promise. He flipped the photo over and found a date scribbled on the back, June 12, 1975. Beneath it was a single word: forever. Mark sat back in his chair, the pieces of the puzzle slowly clicking into place. The bench wasn't just a place for Leila, it was their place. It was where they'd shared moments of joy, where they'd dreamed of the future. And now, decades later, it seemed to be the only connection she had left to the life they'd built together. But something still didn't add up. Why every night? Why now, after all these years? And what was the promise she'd mentioned? As the clock struck midnight, Mark closed the file and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. He felt closer to understanding Leila, but the mystery was far from solved. He knew he couldn't let it go, not now. The next evening, he returned to the park, this time determined to get answers. Leila was there, as he knew she would be, sitting in her usual spot under the flickering street lamp. She didn't seem surprised to see him, and when he approached, she offered him a faint smile. "Back again, Sheriff?" she asked, her tone light but with an edge of knowing. "I have a feeling you were expecting me," Mark said, sitting down beside her. She didn't reply, just stared out into the darkness. After a long pause, she spoke. "You've been asking about me, haven't you?" Mark hesitated, then nodded. "People are curious. I'm curious." Lila sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. "Curiosity is a dangerous thing, Sheriff. Sometimes it uncovers things best left buried." Her words sent a chill down Mark's spine, but he pressed on. "I found a photo," he said gently, "of you and Arthur. On this bench, it was in the town records." Lila's eyes softened at the mention of her husband's name. "Arthur loved this bench," she said quietly. "He said it was the perfect spot to sit and dream about the future." Mark waited, sensing she had more to say. "We made a promise," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "that no matter what happened, we'd always meet here. This was our place, our sanctuary." Her words hung in the air, heavy with emotion. Mark felt his throat tighten, but he couldn't let the conversation end there. "Leila," he said carefully, "why now? Why every night?" Lila turned to him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Because I'm keeping my end of the promise," she said simply. "I'm waiting." "For what?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up, just as she had the night before, and began to walk away. "Good night, Sheriff," she said over her shoulder. Mark watched her disappear into the shadows, his heart heavy with unanswered questions. What, or who, was she waiting for? And why did he feel like there was something more to her story, something just out of reach? As he stood there under the flickering street lamp, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that the truth, whatever it was, would change everything. The nights grew colder as fall deepened, but Leela still came to the bench without fail. She would sit there, motionless, her gaze fixed on some faraway place that no one else could see. Sheriff Mark Henson, driven by a gnawing sense of duty, or perhaps something more personal, found himself returning to the park almost every evening. He'd watch from a distance at first, unsure of how to approach her again, unsure if he even should. But the unanswered questions hung in the air like the chill of the season, refusing to let him rest. One evening, as the wind rustled the last of the autumn leaves, Mark decided to visit the local nursing home. He had heard whispers that Leela occasionally volunteered there, though no one could say why. When he arrived, he was greeted by a cheerful nurse named Emily, who seemed eager to chat. "Miss Leela." "Oh, she's a sweetheart," Emily said as she led Mark down a quiet hallway. "She comes by a couple of times a week. Reads to the residents, talks to them. She's got this calming presence, you know. It's like she understands what they're going through." "Does she ever talk about herself?" Mark asked. Emily paused, her brow furrowing. "Not much. She's private. But there's one gentleman she spends a lot of time with, Mr. Grayson. He doesn't talk to many people, but with her, it's different. They just sit together, mostly in silence. It's kind of beautiful, in a way." Mark's curiosity was piqued. "Can I meet him?" Emily hesitated, glancing at the clock. "He's probably in the common room now. I'll take you to him, but just so you know, Mr. Grayson has good days and bad days. He might not want to talk." When they reached the common room, Mark spotted an older man sitting in a wheelchair near the window. His shoulders were hunched, and he stared out at the empty courtyard with a distant expression. There was a quiet sadness about him, a loneliness that Mark recognized from his conversations with Leela. "Mr. Grayson," Emily said gently, touching his shoulder. "This is Sheriff Henson. He'd like to say hello." The man turned his head slowly, his eyes clouded with age and something more profound, grief, perhaps, or regret. He nodded but didn't speak. Mark pulled up a chair and sat beside him. "I hear you know Leela," he began, keeping his tone light. A flicker of recognition crossed Mr. Grayson's face. "Leela," he murmured, his voice rough but steady. "She's a good woman. Strong." "Do you know why she goes to the park every night?" Mark asked, leaning in slightly. Mr. Grayson's gaze shifted to the courtyard again. For a long moment, he said nothing, and Mark began to wonder if he'd pushed too hard. But then the older man spoke. "She's waiting," he said simply. "For Arthur?" Mark asked, his pulse quickening. Mr. Grayson turned to him, his eyes sharper now, filled with something Mark couldn't quite place. "Not just Arthur," he said. "She's waiting for forgiveness." The words hung in the air, heavy and inexplicable. Mark's mind raced. Forgiveness. For what? He wanted to press further, but Emily touched his arm lightly, signaling that it was time to go. As he walked back to his car, Mark couldn't shake the weight of Mr. Grayson's words. Forgiveness. It added another layer to the mystery, one he hadn't anticipated. Was there something in Leela's past, some unresolved guilt that tied her to that bench? The following day, Mark returned to the town records office, determined to uncover more about Leela's history. He sifted through old newspaper clippings, school yearbooks, and property records, piecing together fragments of her life. Most of what he found confirmed what he already knew. Leela had been a beloved teacher, a devoted wife, and an active member of the community. But there was one article, buried deep in the archives, that caught his attention. The headline read, "Tragedy at Cedar Grove Park. Local man killed in late-night altercation. The article was dated June 12, 1975, the same date written on the back of the photo he'd found. Mark's heart raced as he read the details. The victim, a man named Daniel Harper, had been found near the bench in the park, the apparent victim of a violent dispute. The case had been closed quickly, with the authorities ruling it a tragic accident. Witnesses were scarce, and no charges were ever filed. But one detail stood out. Lila's name was mentioned in the article. She had been listed as a witness, though the report noted that she was too distraught to provide a statement at the time. Mark leaned back in his chair, the pieces of the puzzle swirling in his mind. A violent death, a promise, and now the idea of forgiveness. It was becoming clear that whatever Lila was holding onto, it was rooted in that night. He decided it was time to confront her again, but this time he needed to tread carefully. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark returned to the park. Lila was there, as always, her silhouette framed by the golden light of the setting sun. He approached her slowly, his footsteps crunching on the gravel path. She didn't look at him as he sat down beside her, but he could feel the tension in the air. "Lila," he began, his voice soft but firm, "I need to know about June 12, 1975. Her body stiffened, and for a moment, Mark thought she might walk away again. But then she sighed, a deep, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of decades. "You've been digging," she said, her tone a mix of resignation and sadness. "I have," Mark admitted, "but I don't have the full story. I think you do." Lila turned to him, her eyes filled with a sorrow so profound it took his breath away. "That night," she said slowly, "changed everything. It was supposed to be a celebration. Arthur and I had big news to share. We were expecting a child." Mark felt a pang of surprise but stayed silent, letting her continue. "We'd asked Daniel to meet us at the park," she went on. "He was Arthur's brother. They were close, but they'd had their differences, especially about the business. Arthur wanted to leave the mill and start his own shop, but Daniel didn't agree. He thought it was a betrayal of their father's legacy." Her voice broke, and she took a moment to compose herself. That night, things got heated. Words were said, tempers flared, and then she paused, her hands trembling. Then it was over. Arthur tried to stop him, tried to calm him down, but Daniel slipped. He fell. "The bench," she stopped, unable to continue. Mark's mind raced, the image of the scene forming in his head. An argument, an accident, a life lost. But there was still so much he didn't understand. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked gently. Lila looked at him, her eyes hollow. "Because I was afraid. Afraid of what people would think, of what it would do to Arthur." And then, before I could make sense of it all, he was gone too. The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. Arthur's death, Daniel's fall, the promise, everything was connected, tangled in a web of love, guilt, and grief. But even now, as the pieces began to fit together, Mark knew there was more to the story. The truth was still out there, just beyond his reach. And Lila, with her quiet strength and unyielding resolve, held the key. As the night deepened, Mark realized that this mystery was far from over. Lila's story wasn't just about the past, it was about what lay ahead. And whatever that was, he was determined to see it through. The air was colder now, a biting chill that hinted winter was just around the corner. Yet Lila remained at the bench every night, a solitary figure lost in her own memories. Sheriff Mark Henson, now more involved in her story than he ever anticipated, found himself consumed by the pieces he had uncovered. The promise to Arthur, the accident with Daniel, the guilt that had haunted Lila for decades. It was all tangled in a web that still had loose ends. And Mark couldn't ignore the feeling that there was something deeper, something that Lila wasn't yet ready to share. He couldn't let it go. Not now. The park wasn't just a place to sit anymore. It had become a symbol, a place where lives had intersected, where grief lingered, and where forgiveness seemed both impossible and necessary. Mark decided it was time to push further, even if it meant stepping into territory Lila wasn't ready to explore. He owed it to her and to himself to uncover the whole truth. One evening, as the wind howled through the barren trees, Mark approached the bench once again. Lila didn't seem surprised to see him, though her face was lined with wariness. She looked older in the dim light, her shoulders stooped under the weight of something invisible but crushing. She nodded as he sat down, as if she had been expecting him. "Leela," Mark began, his voice steady but soft, "I know it's hard to talk about, but I think there's more to what happened that night, something you're still holding on to." Leela didn't respond immediately. Her hands, clasped tightly in her lap, trembled slightly. Finally, she exhaled, her breath visible in the cold air. "You think you have all the answers, don't you, Sheriff?" she said, her tone quiet but sharp. "But the truth isn't as simple as what you found in your files." Mark leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Then tell me," he said. "Help me understand." For a long moment, Layla was silent. Then she began to speak, her voice tinged with both pain and defiance. "You think it was just an accident," she said. "That Daniel fell, and that was the end of it. But you don't know what came after. You don't know what it did to Arthur." Mark frowned, sensing the weight of her words. "What do you mean?" Lila's gaze shifted to the ground, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Arthur blamed himself," she said. "He couldn't forgive himself for what happened, and neither could I, not fully. We told ourselves it was an accident, but deep down, we both knew it wasn't." Mark felt a chill run down his spine, and it wasn't from the cold. "What are you saying, Leela?" She looked at him then, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to consume her. "Daniel didn't just fall," she said. He pushed Arthur first. They were fighting and Arthur, he pushed back. He didn't mean to, but Daniel lost his balance, and that was it. In that moment, everything changed." Mark sat back, the weight of her confession settling over him like a heavy blanket. The accidental death was no accident. It was a moment of anger, a split-second decision that had spiraled into tragedy. And Leela had been carrying the burden of that moment ever since. "I tried to convince him it wasn't his fault," she continued, her voice breaking. "But Arthur couldn't live with it. He withdrew, became a shadow of the man he used to be. And then one day, he was just gone." Mark remembered the file he had read about Arthur's death. A drowning ruled as suicide. But now, hearing Lila's side of the story, he understood the depth of her loss. Arthur hadn't just died. He had been consumed by guilt, by the weight of what he had done and what it meant for his family. "And you?" Mark asked gently. "What about you?" Leela shook her head, a bitter smile playing on her lips. "I stayed," she said simply, "because I couldn't leave. Not after everything. I made a promise to Arthur, to keep his memory alive, to make sure people remembered the man he was before that night. And so I come here every night, to the place where it all began and ended." Mark's heart ached for her. The woman sitting beside him wasn't just grieving. She was trapped in a cycle of guilt and remembrance, unable to move forward. But there was still one question he needed answered. "Why now?" he asked. "Why keep coming back after all these years?" Leela hesitated, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Because," she said finally, "I'm waiting for a sign. Something to tell me it's okay to let go. That Arthur and Daniel have forgiven me, and that I can forgive myself." Mark didn't know what to say. The idea of waiting for forgiveness, of seeking closure in a place so tied to tragedy, felt both heartbreaking and profoundly human. He wanted to help her, to give her the peace she so desperately needed, but he didn't know how. As the night deepened, they sat in silence, the tension between them almost palpable. Mark's mind raced, trying to piece together what he could do, what he could say to ease her burden. But before he could speak again, Leela broke the silence. "There's something else," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Something I haven't told anyone." Mark turned to her, his pulse quickening. "What is it?" Leela hesitated, her hands trembling again. "That night," she said slowly, I wasn't just a witness. I was part of it. I tried to stop them, to pull them apart, but I couldn't. And when Daniel fell, I was the one who told Arthur we had to leave. I was the one who said we couldn't stay. Her confession hit Mark like a tidal wave. Layla hadn't just been a bystander, she had made a choice, one that had shaped the events that followed. And now, decades later, she was still paying the price. I thought I was protecting him, she said, tears streaming down her face. But all I did was make it worse. And now, I don't know if I'll ever be free of it. Mark felt a lump in his throat as he watched her, this woman who had carried so much for so long. He wanted to tell her it wasn't her fault, that she deserved peace, but he knew the words would sound hollow. The truth was, the only person who could forgive Layla was Leela herself. As the wind howled through the park, Mark realized they were standing on the edge of something monumental. The truth was out, but the resolution, the forgiveness, the peace, was still just out of reach. And as the night stretched on, he couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was still to come. The night grew heavier, the wind carrying a low whistle through the park as if echoing the tension between Leela and Mark. The sheriff sat quietly, absorbing the weight of her confession. Layla's pain was tangible, layered with years of grief and guilt, but there was something else, a detail Mark couldn't quite place. Her words felt final, yet incomplete, like a puzzle missing its last, crucial piece. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask more questions, but Leela beat him to it. "There's something you don't know," she said suddenly, her voice trembling as her gaze darted around the park, almost as if she feared being overheard. "Something I haven't told anyone, not even Arthur." Mark frowned, leaning slightly closer. "What is it, Leela? You've come this far. I think it's time to let it all out." Leela hesitated, her fingers twisting the edge of her coat. She stared ahead, into the darkness, her expression haunted. "The night Daniel fell," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone else was there." Mark froze, his mind racing. "Someone else? What do you mean?" Leela nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line, as if saying the words aloud pained her. "It wasn't just the three of us," she said. "There was another boy, someone from the neighborhood. I didn't recognize him at first. He was just watching, standing a little ways off. But after it happened, I saw him run." Mark felt the air shift around him, a chill settling over his skin that had nothing to do with the cold. This was something new, a revelation that cracked open the entire story. "Did you ever find out who he was?" he asked, his voice sharp with urgency. Leela shook her head. "No. I didn't know how to look for him back then, and honestly, I was too afraid. What if he saw everything? What if he told someone? But he never came forward, and over time I convinced myself I had imagined him, that maybe it was just my mind playing tricks." Mark's heart pounded in his chest. If there had been another witness, it could change everything. He could feel the stakes rising, the past becoming more alive with every word Layla spoke. "And you've never told anyone about this?" he asked. "No," Leela said, her voice breaking. "Not even Arthur. I thought it wouldn't matter, that it wouldn't change anything. But lately, I don't know. Something about it keeps coming back to me. I can't stop thinking about that boy." Mark didn't respond immediately, his mind working overtime. If there had been another person there that night, someone who saw what truly happened, it could unravel everything Layla and Arthur had believed about the tragedy. And if that person had stayed silent all these years, it begged the question, why? "Do you remember anything about him?" Mark asked, his tone measured. "Anything at all?" Leela's brow furrowed as she dug through her memories. "He was young," she said slowly. "Maybe a teenager. He had a bike, an old beat-up one, and his jacket, it had patches on it, like he was trying to fix it up himself. But that's all I remember. It was so dark, and everything happened so fast." Mark nodded, storing the details in his mind. A teenager with a patched jacket and a bike. It wasn't much to go on, but it was more than he had a moment ago. "Leela," he said gently. This could be important. If that boy saw something, or if he knows something, we need to find him. She looked at him, her expression a mix of fear and hope. Do you really think he's still out there? She asked. That he remembers? Mark's jaw tightened. If he was there that night, I don't think it's something he could forget, he said. But we won't know until we try. Leila nodded slowly, though her face was pale. If you think it will help, she said. But I don't know if I can face it. What if it changes everything? What if it makes it worse? Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Sometimes the truth is the only way forward, he said, even if it's hard. And you're not alone in this, Leila. I'll help you every step of the way. The words seemed to comfort her, though the fear in her eyes didn't completely fade. As Mark sat back, his mind churned with possibilities. The boy's identity was a mystery, but the thought of finding him sparked a new sense of purpose. It wasn't just about solving an old tragedy anymore. It was about giving Leila a chance at closure, a chance to finally lay her demons to rest. But even as he resolved to dig deeper, a nagging thought lingered at the back of his mind. If the boy had stayed silent for so long, it could mean he had something to hide. And if that was the case, finding him might bring more than just answers. It might bring danger. As the hours passed, Mark and Leila sat in silence, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. And as the park grew darker, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something huge, something that could change everything they thought they knew. The sheriff's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen. It was one of his deputies. I have to take this, he said, standing and stepping a few paces away. Leila watched him, her eyes filled with a quiet unease. She couldn't hear his words, but the tone of his voice shifted, growing sharper, more serious. When he returned, his expression was grim. What is it? She asked, her voice trembling. Mark hesitated, his jaw tightening. We might have a lead, he said finally. One of my deputies found an old record of a teenager matching your description. He lived in the area at the time, but he moved away shortly after the accident. Leila's breath caught. Do you think it's him? Mark nodded slowly. It's possible, he said, but there's something else. His name came up again a few years later, in connection to another incident. Leila's stomach dropped. What kind of incident? Mark's eyes met hers, his expression unreadable. A missing persons case, he said. The details are sketchy, but it might be connected. I'll know more once I dig into it. Leila's mind raced, her thoughts a whirlwind of fear and uncertainty. The boy wasn't just a witness, he might be tied to something bigger, something darker. And as the reality sank in, she realized the stakes were higher than she ever imagined. Mark stood, his expression resolute. I need to follow this lead, he said. But I need you to be ready, Leila. Whatever we find, it might not be what you expect. She nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. The path they were on was filled with shadows, with questions that might never have easy answers. But for the first time in decades, Leila felt a spark of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Mark's investigation into the boy's identity moved faster than either of them expected. By the next morning, he had tracked down a name: Jacob Turner. A teenager at the time of Daniel's accident, Jacob had left the small town shortly afterward, his family relocating under sudden and unexplained circumstances. The missing persons case Mark had mentioned earlier was tied to Jacob's younger brother, who had disappeared without a trace 5 years later. Something about the Turner family seemed shrouded in mystery, and Mark knew he was closing in on answers that had remained hidden for far too long. Leila sat nervously in her living room, the weight of the revelations pressing down on her. Every sound outside made her jump. Every knock at the door sent her heart racing. When Mark arrived to update her, she could see the tension etched on his face. He explained what he had uncovered, laying out the pieces of the puzzle they now had. There's more, he said carefully, watching her reaction. Jacob's name came up in another file, a report of a confrontation at the park around the same time Daniel died. A witness claimed to see him arguing with another boy near the creek. Leela's breath caught. "Do you think he had something to do with what happened to Daniel?" she asked, her voice trembling. Mark hesitated. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I need to talk to him. If he's still alive, he might be the only one who can give us the full truth." The search for Jacob led Mark to a quiet, unassuming neighborhood on the outskirts of a nearby city. The house was modest, its yard overgrown, as though it had been left untended for years. Mark knocked on the door, his heart pounding. When it creaked open, the man who stood before him was a shadow of the boy Leela had described. Older, weathered, his eyes guarded. "Jacob Turner?" Mark asked. The man nodded cautiously. "Who's asking?" "I'm Sheriff Mark Collins. I'm here about the night Daniel Matthews died." Jacob's expression shifted, his face tightening. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said, his voice low. Inside, the house was sparse, the walls bare except for a few old photographs. Jacob motioned for Mark to sit, his movements deliberate, almost reluctant. He sat across from the sheriff, his hands clasped tightly together. "I knew this day would come," Jacob said finally, breaking the silence. "I've been waiting for it." Mark leaned forward. "Then you know why I'm here," he said. "I need to know what happened that night. Leila saw you there. She said you ran after Daniel fell. What did you see?" Jacob's eyes flickered with something. Regret, pain, perhaps fear. "I didn't just see it," he said quietly. "I was part of it." Mark's stomach dropped. "What do you mean?" Jacob exhaled slowly, his shoulders slumping. "Daniel didn't fall by accident," he said. "We were arguing. He found out something about me, something I didn't want anyone to know. I got angry, pushed him too hard. I didn't mean for him to fall, but when he did, his voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands." Mark felt a wave of shock and anger. "You've been hiding this for decades," he said, his voice stern. "Why didn't you come forward? Why did you let Leela and Arthur suffer all these years?" Jacob looked up, his eyes red. "I was scared," he admitted. "I thought no one would believe me. And then my brother went missing, and I thought it was punishment for what I did, like I was cursed." Mark took a deep breath, trying to process the confession. "What about your brother?" he asked. "What happened to him?" Jacob shook his head. "I don't know," he said. "He disappeared one night, just like that. I've searched for him ever since, but it's like he vanished into thin air." As Jacob spoke, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. It was a message from one of his deputies. The words made his blood run cold. "Found something near the creek. Looks like an old jacket with patches. Matches the description Leela gave." Mark looked up at Jacob, his mind racing. "We found something," he said. "Something from that night." Jacob's face paled. "What is it?" Mark didn't answer, instead standing and motioning for Jacob to follow him. The two of them drove back to the park, the weight of the past pressing down on them. When they arrived, Layla was already there, standing near the edge of the creek with a deputy. She turned when she saw them, her expression a mix of confusion and dread. "What's going on?" she asked. Mark held up the jacket, the patches faded but still visible. "We found this near the creek," he said. "It matches what you described." Leela stared at it, her hand covering her mouth. Jacob stepped forward, his face ashen. "That's mine," he said quietly. "I lost it that night." The air was thick with tension as Mark pieced together the timeline. "You left this behind when you ran," he said. "But why didn't anyone find it before now?" Jacob shook his head, his eyes wide. "I don't know," he said. "It doesn't make sense." As they stood there, the sound of rushing water filled the silence. Mark felt a strange unease, as though the park itself held secrets they weren't meant to uncover. And then, just as he was about to speak, Leela gasped, pointing toward the creek. There, caught in the roots of an old tree, was something no one expected to find, a rusted locket, its chain tangled in the branches. Mark carefully retrieved it, opening it to reveal a photograph inside. The image was faded, but unmistakable. It was a picture of Jacob's brother, Jacob stared at it, his hands trembling. How did this get here? He whispered. Mark didn't have an answer, but one thing was clear. The night Daniel died wasn't just an accident. It was the beginning of a web of secrets, one that reached far deeper than anyone had imagined. And as they stood there, the weight of the truth pressing down on them, Mark realized the story wasn't over. Not yet. The discovery of the locket sent a chill through everyone standing by the creek. Jacob turned it over in his trembling hands, his expression a mix of disbelief and anguish. The photo inside, though faded and worn by time, was unmistakable. It was his younger brother, smiling as if frozen in a moment of innocence. Jacob's voice was barely a whisper as he muttered, "I gave him this locket when he turned 10. He never took it off. How did it end up here?" Mark's mind raced. The evidence tied the Turner family's tragedy to this spot, but it didn't make sense. Jacob's brother had disappeared years after Daniel's death. Why would the locket resurface now, tangled in the roots of an old tree? Mark knew they were missing pieces, parts of the story that still lay buried. Leela stood nearby, her arms wrapped around herself as if shielding herself from the weight of the past. Her gaze shifted between Jacob and the locket. "Do you think," she began hesitantly, "your brother saw something that night? Could he have been there?" Jacob shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "He was just a kid," he said. "I never brought him to the park that late. At least, I don't think I did." His voice cracked, the doubt in his own memories haunting him. Mark stepped in, his tone steady but firm. "We need to keep digging. This locket didn't just appear here by accident. There's something about this place, something we've missed all these years." The sheriff ordered his deputies to expand the search around the creek, combing through the surrounding area for anything else that might provide answers. As they worked, Jacob and Leela sat on the bench, the weight of shared grief binding them in an unspoken understanding. The years of pain, regret, and unanswered questions seemed to hang in the air between them. "I never meant for any of this to happen," Jacob said quietly, breaking the silence. "I was just a scared, angry kid who made a terrible mistake. If I could go back." Leela placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft but firm. "We can't change the past, Jacob, but maybe we can finally bring some peace to it." Hours passed as the deputies searched the area. Just as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, one of them called out, "Sheriff, over here." Mark hurried to the spot, Leela and Jacob close behind. The deputy held up a small metal box, heavily rusted and partially buried in the dirt. Mark carefully pried it open, revealing a collection of items inside. A few old photographs, a bundle of letters, and a small notebook. The items were damp and fragile, but still legible. As Mark flipped through the notebook, his heart sank. The handwriting inside belonged to Daniel. "He kept a journal," Mark said, his voice tinged with awe and sorrow. "It looks like he wrote about everything, his thoughts, his friends, even the arguments he had." Leela's hands trembled as she reached for the notebook. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the faded words. Then she stopped, her breath catching. "Here," she said, pointing to an entry dated just days before his death. Mark read aloud, his voice steady but somber. "Jacob's been acting strange lately. He seems scared, like he's hiding something. I tried to ask him about it, but he got angry. I don't know what's going on, but I feel like it's something big." Jacob looked away, guilt etched deeply into his features. "He was right," he said softly. "I was hiding something. I didn't want anyone to know I was struggling, that I was scared. But I never thought. I didn't think he'd try to confront me." As they continued reading, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Daniel had suspected something about the Turner family's secrets, something he had been trying to uncover. The letters in the box, written by Jacob's brother, hinted at a strained family dynamic and hinted at a fear of someone close to them. The truth was more complex than anyone had imagined. In the days that followed, Mark worked tirelessly to piece together the full story. The items in the box provided crucial insights, shedding light on the events that had led to Daniel's death and the Turners' subsequent disappearance. It became clear that Jacob's brother had indeed witnessed something that night, something he had kept hidden out of fear. The locket's presence at the creek was a sign that he had returned to the scene at some point, perhaps in search of closure, only to leave behind a piece of himself in the process. For Leela, the revelations brought a bittersweet sense of resolution. She had spent years sitting on that bench, lost in memories and unanswered questions, only to find that the answers had been there all along, waiting to be uncovered. While the truth didn't erase the pain of losing her son, it allowed her to finally let go of the anger and guilt that had consumed her for so long. Jacob, too, found a measure of peace in the aftermath. He confessed to his role in Daniel's death, but Leela, in an act of profound forgiveness, chose not to press charges. Instead, she encouraged him to use his second chance to honor Daniel's memory by helping others who might be struggling as he once had. The gesture marked the beginning of a tentative but meaningful friendship between the two, rooted in shared grief and a mutual desire for healing. The park, once a place of sorrow and loss, became a symbol of renewal. Mark worked with the community to restore it, dedicating a small memorial to Daniel near the bench where Leela had spent so many nights. The plaque read, "In loving memory of Daniel Matthews, a reminder that the truth, though painful, can set us free." As for Mark, the case left a lasting impression on him. It reminded him of the importance of persistence, compassion, and the courage to face the past, no matter how difficult it might be. He continued to serve the town with unwavering dedication, carrying the lessons of the case with him in every investigation that followed. In the end, the park returned to its former quiet beauty, the creek flowing gently as though washing away the pain of the past. And though the bench remained, it was no longer a place of sorrow, but a symbol of resilience and the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. Leela still visited occasionally, sitting quietly and letting the memories come and go like the breeze. But now, when she looked out at the park, she felt not just the weight of what she had lost, but also the comfort of what she had gained: closure, understanding, and the strength to move forward.